Hi everyone, my name is Chloe and today I'm going to be talking to you about my research project. I looked into resilience and specifically the effects of attachment style and psychoeducation on resilience. So what is resilience? There's a bit of a debate within the academic and research community as to what resilience really is. Some people think it's characteristic, some people think it's an outcome of adverse experiences or adverse life events. But regardless to what people think it is, we know that it's really important to be investing in our resilience. Increased resilience can be so helpful, especially now due to the decreased access to our public mental health services and the long waiting lists that people are facing due to COVID-19 repercussions. So we know that resilience and self-resilience is really important to be increasing as much as we can. So because of that dispute of definition, I've gone with Herman's definition, which is positive adaptation or the ability to maintain or regain sound mental health despite experiencing adversity. So it's good to keep that in mind as we go through the presentation as to what I've defined resilience as. So onto our first independent variable then, which is attachment style. We've got previous literature that tells us already that adult attachment styles often can impact our resilience levels, and in particular, secure attachment styles often being correlated with a higher resiliency, and insecure attachment styles often being correlated with lower resiliencies. And some of the outworkings of that can be seen in confidence levels. People with secure attachment styles can often appear to be more confident, have a more secure internal working model, and are often better at accessing their support systems. And the opposite can be seen of that for insecure attachment styles and lower resiliency. Onto our second independent variable then, psychoeducation. Many of you will be familiar with the term psychoeducation already, but I've just put a definition at the top there which talks about psychoeducation with the context of the mental health sector. It describes psychoeducation as the education of clients, patients and or family members about mental illnesses they're experiencing or interact with. And that can also include friendship groups and any individual really, any education of individuals providing a psychological background. So it's important to bear that in mind as well as we work through the presentation. So we've got previous research that also suggests that psychoeducation can impact our resilience. It is used really widely in the mental health field for multiple disorders, so it's really malleable and can be used to treat anxiety, depression, and I talk a bit more later on about its different uses. But it can be so varied and can be delivered in so many different ways that it can be really cost effective, and a lot of different people can have access to it. So it's accessible and effective through online, in-person and self-taught modes of delivery, which can be really useful, especially since, like I talked before about COVID-19 and the introduction of that social distancing and being able to access things remotely. So if we know all this already, then what did we investigate and why is it important to investigate it? So we were looking at the strength of relationships between resilience and attachment style, and then resilience and psychoeducation. Why was that important then? So why were we investigating it? We want to know, do we have control over our resilience levels? So we talked a bit before about attachment and how attachment the style developed in childhood can often continue into adulthood and can be difficult to change and alter. So if our attachment style is impacting our resilience levels positively or negatively, can we change that? Can we affect that in any way? And then on the other hand, with psychoeducation, we know that is a lot more of an accessible tool. we know we have more control over our psychoeducation exposure. And so if that has a stronger relationship, could we use that regardless of attachment style? And do we need to be aware of attachment style when trying to increase our resilience? So we want to be able to input into our own resilience. We want to be able to increase it, to be able to decrease the strain on the public mental health sector. And that's really the motivation behind this study. So what we were hoping to see then for our hypothesis was that secure attachment style would correlate with higher levels of resilience, and higher levels of psychoeducation would correlate with high levels of resilience. High levels of psychoeducation would correlate with high levels of resilience. So really just a continuation and a backing up and a support of previous literature, but also having a look for the difference in strength of relationship between the two. So what did we do then for our methods? We distributed an online survey using Qualtrics, and that was made up of 4 questionnaires, and that'll be talked about in the next slide. And that provided us to be able to do a quantitative analysis. And there was no exclusion criteria for participants, apart from that they had to be over 18 years of age. So that was distributed to the general public, social media and word of mouth. So for the questionnaires then, we used the adult attachment questionnaire, the revised version, to measure our attachment. The revised version of Collins focuses on all close attachments, whereas the original IAQ only focused on romantic relationships. So that's important. If repeating the study or replicating the study, if you wanted to make any changes there, it might be interesting to focus on the original one. We used the revised. We also used the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale. As you can see from my independent variables, I didn't focus on wellbeing as an independent variable measured against resilience. But if you are interested in that, another member of my group, Alex Gillespie, he focused on wellbeing and resilience. So you can always go and have a look to see what he found for his results. The next, we used a custom psychoeducation measure. So when we were looking for measures for psychoeducation, we didn't find one that was appropriate for our study. And so another member of my group, Marissa Basson, she created a custom measure for our study, which had 2 sections that we can look more in detail in later on. But the first part measured psychological knowledge of mental health and psychological terms, and the second part measured the application of those. So if the people completing the questionnaire were engaging with those terms in day-to-day life. Finally, then we used our resilience evaluation scale to measure the resilience variable. So what did we see then? Well, we had 149 participants respond, but only 41 participants were included in the actual data analysis. And some of that exclusion criteria can be related to incomplete tests, people missing questions, closing the test early, too many prefer not to say options. That would be what made up our exclusion criteria. So we were left with 26 females and 15 male participants. So looking at our results then for attachment, you can see on table 1 on the left that we've got our different attachment styles and how many participants were put into each one. At the top there, you can see a borderline category. So we created the borderline category as these participants would have been excluded otherwise, as they lay on the borderlines between the different attachment styles. So according to the IAQ, they wanted us to remove those participants as they would be outliers, or they wouldn't fit into a particular category. But we decided to keep those in to see how many participants would have been excluded, and 9 participants stayed in our borderline category. So that's quite interesting to see how many participants would have been excluded. And I talk more in detail about that in the handouts as to why that's important to keep those in there. So as you can see, we used Bartholomew's 4 attachment styles that was suggested by the AAQ, and these were used in our SPSS data analysis. So as we hoped, we saw a higher frequency of participants in the securely attached style, which is really good, followed by preoccupied and then fearful and dismissive. So we found a significant relationship for our attachment styles with resilience. You can see on the figure 1 on the right, we've got securely attached participants with a higher resilience mean score. So our securely attached participants had a higher mean resilience, and that was significantly different to our fearful group, which had the lowest resiliency score. There was also a significant relationship between our secure group and the borderline group as well, and I'll go into a bit more detail about what that means in the discussion. Secondly then, onto our psychoeducation variable. Here we see the two sections of the psychoeducation measure. So I ran 1 sample t-tests for section 1 and for section 2 to measure separately the psychological knowledge score against resilience and the application of those terms and resilience. So that identified significant correlations for both sections. So the higher the psychological knowledge of the participant, the higher their resiliency, and the higher their application score, so the more terms they used and applied in their day-to-day life of those mental health terms and the self-care terms, the higher their resiliency. However, when those 2 sections were combined, an ANOVA was ran to measure them against resilience, and that gave us an insignificant result. So overall, that psychoeducation variable and the resiliency variable gave us an insignificant relationship. So if we just head back to our hypothesis reminder then, what were we hoping to find? We're hoping to find that secure attachment style will correlate with high levels of resilience, and high levels of psychoeducation will correlate with high levels of resilience. So our secure attachment style was right, but we didn't find any supporting results for that high level of psychoeducation with the 2 sections combined and higher resiliency levels. However, we did find that separately, those 2 separate sections with psychological mental health knowledge and awareness related to higher resilience, and the application of those terms were related and correlated to a higher resilience. So still significant findings, just not in what we expected. So what does that mean? This brings us to our discussion points. So if we look first at our discussion surrounding resiliency and attachment, our results supported previous literature, and in specific, we found that fearful attachment was related to lower resilience. It could be suggested that fearful attachment is often comorbid with anxiety and depression disorders, which then we do often see lower resiliency. So that is a potential explanation for that correlation. Moving round to the middle, we talk about our borderline group. So that was a real strength of our study, the inclusion of the borderline group. It allowed us to be able to see how many participants would have excluded, which was around 20% of our participants that would have been excluded otherwise. And a hypothesis, or a potential explanation for why that borderline group was associated with a low resiliency could be that there are multiple insecure categories that were included in that group, which would make sense for the association with a lower resiliency. So that's a potential explanation there. So what does this mean then? What does that suggest? So it suggests that there might be requirements or adjustments needed for people who fall into that borderline category, that do take part in research and that are needing support. And they're not outliers, they are people and they still need effective support. So what does that mean if they do fit into a category? It means that their adjustments might need to be made for them so they receive the appropriate care and support. In addition to that, we need to understand and recognise that attachment style does impact when we're building our resilience. So what does that mean for future research? Well, we need to know how to implement attachment style into the building of resiliency, and how people and mental health professionals can tailor their approach, can tailor their work with clients depending on their attachment style. On to the discussion points for psychoeducation then. So our previous literature was not supported by our results, but is this due to research error? So I put that there because our psychoeducation measure didn't measure initially what we wanted it to. So it measured more of a perceived psychoeducation, a perceived understanding, and then application of self-care and psychological terms, rather than a psychoeducation background or actual psychoeducation measure. So potentially a different outcome could have happened if we had more of a psychoeducation measure, such as an intervention study, where we would be definitively able to say that the participants had experienced psychoeducation rather than relying on self-report. So that is a potential suggestion for future research. Despite that research, our outcomes not supporting previous research, we did have some really nice unexpected findings that psychological knowledge and application did increase with higher resiliency. So understanding that the more knowledgeable, the more educated we are, and how much we apply that to our day-to-day lives can impact our resiliency. So as we say there in the middle, so future intervention study could be used to see that implementation of psychoeducation, and if we have multiple groups and control groups, we can see if that does produce a significant effect. So that's a suggestion for future research. We've also learned that the importance of education and implementation of self-care to help impact our own resiliency. And it encourages the fact that we can have control over our resilience. So it's not all dependent on our attachment style. It's not predicted. We can have an impact on our resiliency. And that can come through education and implementation. So a quick summary then. Attachment styles can influence resilience, but so can the individual. So it's important to know that there is some element of control there, regardless of your attachment style. That can be used to an advantage. So understanding and knowing your attachment style can help you to know how to work with that, how to work alongside that with your development and exposure to psychoeducation. This is really important for evidence-based practitioners to be able to tailor their approach to their clients depending on attachment style and psychoeducation exposure. And if you want to know how to build your resilience, you can go to mind.org.uk and search resilience, and there's some tools there to help you build that resilience. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll just pop over to the next slides so you can read through the references. Don't forget to look in the handout and comment any questions that you have below. Thank you.